welcome those of you in person, and I welcome all of you on Zoom and hope that you will participate and put your questions and comments into the chat whenever you wish to do so, and we will address them. So our topic for today is elder abuse, exploring elder abuse. It's a very serious topic, one that I'm passionate about, and I'm hoping that you will share my love for the topic and never need to use the information. That's my hope, that we never need to use this information. I need to get used to doing what I'm doing here. Okay, so I'm welcoming everybody. For those of you who don't know me, especially those of you on Zoom, I would give you a little bit about my background, which is that I am a registered nurse, been one for many, many years. I kind of tell people I'm going to go out in a coffin or a box. My license is going with me. And what I've done for many years is teach nursing assistants and home health aides about what they need to do to be caregivers, to be safe, to avoid elder abuse, to recognize elder abuse. And I'm really happy to bring that topic to all of you today. So the course philosophy, I thought I would share with you my ideas of why this is important and why we should discuss this topic. So all of you who are here today, either on Zoom or in person, should be able to define elder abuse by the time we're finished with this program, identify elder abuse statistics, and identify the many different types of elder abuse. I've lost my presentation. Next slide. It's okay. Hi, Linda. Welcome. And Rabbi, welcome to you too.
Sorry, I can't stay, but I wanted to stop by. I'll stay for 10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes is good. Okay, thank you. So an overview of elder abuse includes the fact that it can happen to anyone, no matter what their age, mostly elderly, no matter what their sex, their race, their religion, or their ethnic background. Elder abuse is pretty much an equal opportunity offender. Every year, hundreds of thousands of adults over the age of 60 are abused. They are probably the largest category of people being abused. They are neglected and or financially exploited. And a large segment of that population is frail, as well as elderly and dependent, meaning on other people. Excuse me just a second while I figure out what's doing here. This is not sitting the way we had it planned. Jeremy is our wonderful tech, and he is going to help me figure out why things are not showing up the way they're supposed to. There we go again. Thank you. I don't know what happened. Okay, thank you. The definition of abuse is it's an intentional action. Someone might injure an elder but not do it intentionally. That's not actually considered elder abuse. It might be carelessness. It might be a lack of thinking, but it wouldn't be elder abuse specifically if it's not intentional. So it's an intentional act that causes harm or creates a serious risk of harm to a vulnerable elder by a caregiver, a spouse, a friend, a neighbor, anyone who's in a trusted relationship with that elder. And it's also a failure to satisfy the elder's basic needs, assuming that that person is responsible for those needs, and the deprivation of necessary goods and or services. It is the infliction of physical and or psychological harm, and it is the failure to protect someone from that harm. There is a penal code in California, Code 368, and it relates to elder abuse. Elder abuse is a crime, and elder abuse requires that a person who's convicted of that be either imprisoned and or fined a monetary fine. Elder abuse refers to people who are 65 and over. It also applies to dependent adults, Those are young people starting at age 18 who go to 64 because 65 they become a little more like an elder in definition. But these are people who have debilitating physical or limitations or mental limitations. The California Penal Code describes the kinds of abuse that are punishable, like I said, by imprisonment to any person who willfully causes harm, pain, suffering, or any other damage to an elder or a dependent adult. You might want to know who the profile is or who the people are who are the main abusers. Would you guess that it would be family members? Because it's 50% of the abusers are family members. Dwight? Oh, yes, self. I'll explain. Yes, you can abuse yourself. One of the main categories of abusing yourself is self-neglect. And that's actually considered an abuse of an actual elder abuse, to be self-neglecting. So 50% of people who do the abusing are family members, which is pretty frightening to me. 30% are people who abuse themselves. We've heard of people, the young people, especially these days, we hear of people cutting themselves. I don't think the elderly are doing that so much. They're more self-neglect. And then caregivers, businesses, and friends are 20% of the profile of abusers. So pick your friends carefully. And if they are abusive, change your friendships, I guess is the only way to deal with that. The profile of abusers also includes people who are suffering with mental illness. They may be having substance abuse, poor social functioning, and they have a conflict between themselves and the elder, the caregiver and the elder. And these are people who are in close contact, oftentimes, with the elder, people who have mental issues or substance abuse, oftentimes are the family members who are the quote caregiver, but at the same time, they are abusive to the person. Linda, yeah. Yes, I am a mandated reporter as a nurse. If you work with the elderly, if you are a banker or in the financial world, you are mandated reporters, which means you have to report it. If you're the next door neighbor, you're not necessarily obligated as a mandated reporter. If you know that somebody's abusing your neighbor or your friend, it's a good conscience thing to report it, but not by law, interestingly enough. I wish it were that more people had to be mandated to report. We would probably get more reporting done. Unfortunately, this goes on a lot of times and people don't know. We don't know what's happening. Or they're afraid. Why don't they report? Let's say you're an 80-year-old person and you're being abused, and maybe you're being abused by your son who lives with you. Well, you're afraid to report that son because you don't want to make him upset. You don't want to have a bad name for the family, or you're afraid of what they might do to you if they find out that you've reported. So many, many times this abuse does not get reported and people suffer in silence. So if you were to try to observe your next door neighbor or your family member, watch for these red flags. If you see a conflict between the caregiver and the elder person, any kind of conflict, yelling, just not being attentive, not being pleasant, any of those things, be aware of body language and tone and demeanor of the caregiver and the elder person. And watch for general cleanliness of the environment. If it's not a place that you want to live, there's a chance that the person's being abused because they're not taking care of them or the environment. And watch at meal times, because if the person's not getting fed an adequate meal or nutrition, that's another form of abuse. And if they're not able to feed themselves and the caregiver isn't taking the time to do that, that's also abuse. Are you able to keep up with me? Okay, so I'm not saying next. Am I supposed to? You're doing well. Okay, great. Jeremy and I are working together for this first time, and I am very grateful for Jeremy to be here as our wonderful tech person. We also need to worry about injuries. If the person has decreased mobility or if they have injuries and there's no reason, you might expect that the caregiver is abusing them physically. Another way to do things that are preventative would be visit the elder person often. That's not just at home. If they happen to be in a facility, a nursing home, long-term care, residential section, you need to visit them, and you shouldn't always announce that you're coming because you want to catch things as they're happening. You need to be cautious and empathetic, even though you may not feel like it, with the caregiver, so they don't take out anything that you have to say or do or see on the resident or the elder person. And if you're noticing something, it's best not to discuss it in front of that elder caregiver or elder abuser. Bye, Rabbi. Take care. That's okay. Got your schedule to take care of.
Ask one question. I
Sure.
don't want to interrupt.
No,
Okay, so this is working? Nope.
now it is.
Quick question on mandated reporting. So
Yes.
clergy are mandated reporters, and sometimes it's very hard to tell. Obviously, those red flags are obvious, but sometimes, I mean, I will hear secondhand that there's suspected behavior of a caregiver, and it's very hard unless you personally see it to know. I mean, obviously, if someone comes to you, then you're mandated to report it. But if it's suspected activity, that's another ballgame. I was wondering if you could address that a little.
Suspicious of elder abuse, you don't have to see it with your own eyes. If you're a mandated reporter, being suspicious of it is sufficient to report it. And that's important to know. So people who are mandated are caregivers, clergy, and fiduciary people, bankers, for instance. If you were to go to the bank, and I have an example of this later on, and ask for a large sum of money, the banker's supposed to ask you why and make sure that there's a legitimate reason and that you're not taking out $10,000 because somebody's scamming you. So I think the main question you have is, do you have to see it? No, you don't. You just have to, if somebody else tells you, you still need to report it. And hopefully something will be done about it. Adult Protective Services, who would be the most logical people you would refer to as a clergy and as those of us in the community, they will take your report and they will investigate. The worst thing that happens, though, is not that you've reported it, but that the people who's being abused, the person who's being abused, doesn't want to admit to it. And if you don't say, I want help, they won't be able to do anything for you. And isn't that sad? So they get the information, they're ready to help, but if the person says, there's nothing wrong, go away, then they have to go away. And that's pretty sad because the system's in place to be helpful. So does that answer your question, sort of?
Yeah, I have to ask one more thing and then I'm not gonna interrupt again. Don't worry.
You may be here all day.
I just know one more thing. So here's the challenge. I have heard suspicions that a certain caregiver is abusing one of my congregants. This is in the past. It's not a current situation. And then I talked to the family member, the child of that congregant, who says, actually, this person's going above and beyond. We want to pay them more. And it's like, so one can get trapped, especially, I mean, and I didn't report it because it's hard in that situation. And the child lived out of state. So things can be complicated is all I'm trying to say.
That's true. Very true. Complicated. The whole situation is complicated. You're right.
Yeah. So thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. I remember being in an intermediate school as a teacher at one time, and there was a set of twins. And the one twin wanted me to take care of the other twin who was being abused by the father. But don't tell anybody. I want to talk to you about it, but don't tell anybody. And I had to say, I'm sorry, I'm required by law to talk to the authorities about this. And then I have to be out of it after that. But it was a very awkward situation. It's the same if somebody comes to you and they want you to help, but they don't want you to divulge it to anybody. How are you supposed to do that? They tie your hands. And that's unfortunate.
And did you tell the authorities?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I was torn, but I believe that one twin was talking about the other. I wasn't about to go to jail, and I wasn't about to have this young lady be abused any further. So yes, I did. Thank you for asking. Yeah. Okay. So when we're talking about precautionary measures, we need to visit this elder person in private. And that sometimes is a challenge because the abuser, if they're present, don't want to leave the elder alone because they don't want the elder to spill the beans on what's happening. And it's necessary to meet with them in person because otherwise they're not going to say anything about what's happening in front of the abuser. And make unannounced visits, like I said, as often as possible, or even on the phone or on the computer. And by all means, trust your instincts. If you see something that doesn't look right, then you're probably correct. Here's a profile of elder abuse victims. Usually they are women who are 75 and older. Usually they live with the abuser, hence the 50% of family members being the abusers. They depend on the abuser for care, and often they are dependent financially and emotionally on the abuser. For instance, their adult children. They are often reluctant to tell anybody about the abuse because they're embarrassed and they fear the consequences of reporting, which is what I said before. So my husband has been a geriatrician, and in his practice, there was an example he mentioned to me about a man who was in a program in Sacramento, really needed that elder program. And the children drew him out of that program and made him go across country to live with them. And there was a financial motivation involved. And when the man got there, after a short time, the adult children thought, oh, this isn't working out. So they put him on a plane back to Sacramento to get back into that program. He was supposed to change planes in Denver, but he had some dementia and he didn't know what to do when he got to Denver. He sat in the Denver airport apparently for 2 days, not having any help, kind of incontinent and sitting in his own waste, until finally someone in the airport turned in the situation and the people from Sacramento had to go and retrieve him and fly him back. Can you imagine being alone in an airport and not knowing where to go? Even when you know what's going on, an airport can be pretty overwhelming. The statistics continue to be the following. The risk of death for those people who are experiencing elder abuse, including self-neglect, are higher. The people who are cognitively impaired are more likely to be abused than people who are not. And people who have depressive symptoms, who are depressed, are also more likely to be abused. And isn't that sad? Mortality rate over a 3-year period of people who are abused, elderly who are abused, is 91%. The non-abused elder person is only 58% for their mortality rate in a 3-year period. That's pretty scary, isn't it? It is to me. Sacramento's aging population statistics include the fact that Sacramento is facing an unprecedented growth in the number of people over the age of 65. The baby boomer population, of which I am a member, is the largest population of seniors ever in the history of the world. And the Area for Agency on Aging, which is a very important agency here in Sacramento that does outreach and has resources for the elderly, they report that by 2040, there will be 800,000 people over the age of 60 living in Sacramento and surrounding counties. And if you take a percentage of how many of those people might be abused, and there are 800,000 people, that's a lot of abuse about to happen that can be and should be prevented. Hi, Rick. Here's just a picture to show you some of the different elderly population we have here in Sacramento. We have a very diverse population, and all of these people within their own cultures may be abused in some way or another. We don't know what every culture's response is to abuse, but for some time, we've thought that a lot of the Asian cultures are much more tuned into the needs of the elderly. I'm afraid that some of the cultures that we have here in Sacramento are not as attentive. So what are the things that contribute to aging or to abuse in the aging population? Physical impairments. They're slower to do things. They have visual impairments. They need somebody to help them do what they need to do. The hearing loss, that's a big one because people who are with an older person who doesn't hear and they're saying all the time, what'd you say? What'd you say? What'd you say? And I have my audience members smiling at me because they can relate. That's frustrating for the caregiver. Polypharmacy means multiple drugs. And if people are using over-the-counter drugs, health supplements, and prescribed medications, there's a likely chance that they're going to have interactions. And some of these interactions can cause a sort of abuse to the people. For instance, if the person is taking something for sleep and then they take something for pain, they could be knocked out for days. And there are people, by the way, I've known of people, and I'm sure it's a known fact, who are using multiple drugs from different sources. For instance, they'll go to the heart doctor for a heart medication. Then they don't feel well with their stomach, so they go to the GI doctor, and then they're having emotional problems, so maybe they'll go to the psychiatrist. And each of those doctors will possibly order a different medication. They don't always look to see if they interact. Your pharmacist is supposed to do that, but if you go to Walgreens for one drug and CVS for another and Costco for another, those computers don't talk to each other. So it's very possible that people who are using multiple medications and they're calling it polypharmacy are not really in good shape because of it. In fact, there are people who the family member thinks that their family member is demented. But it turns out if you take away all the medications and give them what we call a drug holiday, you'll find out that they're really clear that what's happening is because of all the drugs that they're taking. And people think the more drugs we take, the better we're going to be. It's not always the case. And of course, dementia is a challenge for caregivers and does contribute to elder abuse. On the list of the types of elder abuse, this ageism is not one of those listed, but I've found that definitely should be listed. And the reason is those of us who are a little older, I'd like to say a little older, are at risk for ageism. For instance, there is a prejudice and a discrimination against older adults. Do any of you feel that or aware of it? It does exist. And it's ageist practices in healthcare, such as dismissing older adults and their concerns, and or assuming they are less capable. These things can reinforce negative stereotypes of the elderly and can lead to abuse. Ageism also is responsible for inadequate support systems for older people. And that lack of support can oftentimes exasperate and I'm getting tongue-tied, exasperate or make the abuse worse because people are so vulnerable. Addressing and mitigating the harmful effects of ageism is crucial for all of us, for the well-being and all the dignity of all older people. Elders can be regarded as though they are invisible. If any of you is watching Metcalf, or is it Metcalf? No, Matlock, thank you, Matlock. Kathy Bates is the star, and she presents herself as an older woman. She is older, but she presents herself as an older woman to a law firm, and she makes the point that she wants to be invisible, and they will see her as invisible. And I think a lot of older people feel that they are invisible, that they're unintelligent, they're expendable, and they are made to feel this way by their family members, by the community, by healthcare. And I have two examples of stories like this that I want to share with you. One of them is my friend Linda's mother. Her mother was in an abortion care facility, and she developed an illness and had to go to the hospital. And while she was in the hospital, she developed an ulcer on her heel. And then the nursing home board and care was not able to take her back because of this ulcer. So she got put into a nursing home for physical therapy and for care of the wound. The wound didn't heal, and the doctor, if I only knew who he was, he would be reported to the medical board immediately. The doctor's comment was, well, she's old. She's not going to need that leg for much more. We're just going to amputate. Can you imagine? This is a true story. We're going to amputate. Not should we wait and see, not she's still actually able to get around. None of that. We're just going to do it. There is a possibility that that doctor was also intoxicated, but nonetheless, that was never, ever an appropriate comment. And so what happened was, of course, the family took her out of that place and got her better care, sent her back to the board and care with a nurse who was a wound specialist, who was in charge of her care now, and he's a geriatrician. And by the way, we should all be using geriatricians if we are in the elder category, because they know a lot about medications, how they work in an older body, how they last in the body, how they don't last in the bodies, things like that. So I recommend geriatricians very highly. And this particular story of let's amputate, that's totally ageism, right? That's just total, it's stupidity too, but it's ageism. The other story, yes.
What, can you hear me?
Yes.
What would happen in a case though where that victim did not have family?
That's a really good question. Chances are the amputation would have happened, and then she would have been disabled, really disabled for the rest of her life. And it would possibly have shortened her life as well. Can you imagine? It's bad enough if somebody has an amputation because they really need it. Let's say for diabetic circulation or something like that. But when the person just needs some wound care and you're too lazy to offer it or not smart enough to offer it, that's pretty damaging. So, yes, Linda.
And I had a patient who had come from the hospital with a decubitus ulcer. I don't remember what stage it was, but I ordered an air mattress.
Right.
And one of the corporate nurses came to me and said, "How dare you do that? This is a Medi-Cal patient."
Oh,
And I said, "We took the patient. We are responsible for caring for the patient."
wow. So they made it a financial issue that you shouldn't give them an air mattress, which by the way is not all that expensive, because they didn't want to share any of their cost. They didn't want to put up the money for the cost for this person. Wow. And I guess that goes on all the time. That's very frightening. So here's the next story, which I find also just as horrendous as the will amputate story. This gal whose mother was a patient with dementia in her boarding care. She had one of the 6-bed mom and pop places, and her mom was one of her patients. And she was coughing and coughing and coughing. And so she decided to take her to the ER because she knew it wasn't right for her mom to be coughing like that. So the ER doctor, because of ageism, said, oh, well, she's got dementia. She needs to be on all soft foods. She shouldn't be eating regular foods. You just take her home and make sure she has soft foods. The daughter, luckily, was not knowledgeable enough and forceful enough to say, bless you, to say, I'm not satisfied with that answer. I want her to be looked at by a GI doctor. I want x-rays. I want to get to the bottom of it. So this ER doctor was going to write her off as just being old and demented. She actually had to have a bronchoscope and studies done, endoscopy. She had a piece of carrot stuck in her airway. So when this doctor wrote her off just because she's older and had dementia, if that isn't ageism, I don't know what is. And those are two horrible, horrible stories that could have had terrible consequences if family members hadn't been there. So there are many different types of elder abuse. This is a list of the majority of them. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, which is also physical, neglect, self-neglect, financial abuse, which is what we hear about mostly with all the scams. And we're going to do an entire session on scams at the end of this series. It'll be in June, all about the scams. And I can't keep up with them, but I try. There are so many. And like my friend Linda says, if those people who do all the scamming would use their brains for something good, we'd be a lot better off in this world. The other types of abuse include abandonment, abduction, isolation, psychological and emotional abuse, exploitation of resources, and undue influence. This carries over to all different types of parts of our lives. And we're going to go into these coming up now. So physical abuse is the intentional use of physical force that results in pain or bodily injury of some sort and or impairment. It includes over and under medication administration and includes food and water deprivation. I don't think I need to tell anybody how serious dehydration is. And living in California, especially where it gets really hot, and those of you on Zoom who are living in other parts of the world, it's very important to be well hydrated. And I think we all know that. But sometimes we don't pay enough attention to it. And if you have an elder who gets deprived of fluids, they could wind up in the hospital and be seriously ill. The idea of over-medicating or under-medicating is also a serious type of abuse, and it can have real grave consequences for an older person. So what are the other examples of physical abuse? Assault and battery. And I put these on here specifically because they're always used together, assault and battery, like it's one thing, but they're actually two different things. Assault is the involvement of threatening, attempting to cause harm, maybe putting someone in fear that they're going to be harmed, but it's not always a contact issue, like physical contact. On the other hand, battery does include intentionally causing harm or making offensive contact with someone. Battery is the completion of assault, where physical contact actually happens. So they are actually somewhat different from each other, but they are physical types of physical abuse. More physical abuse is the inappropriate use of drugs. There was a nursing home at one point, they probably still do this some places, who called the geriatrician and said, your patient's too noisy. I want you to give them something called Haldol to shut them up. And the physician said, absolutely not. And if you don't take care of them, I will report you to the state. Because if you walk into a nursing home and everything is really quiet, even in the middle of the night, it probably shouldn't be really quiet. You can bet that those people are being drugged to be quiet. And that is elder abuse. Physical restraints are not as usually done nowadays, but when I first started in nursing, people were restrained all the time. Where they are restrained now, though, is in emergency rooms and acute care hospitals. And a lot of that has to do with drug abuse and drug overdoses, where people come in really strong and could be very hurtful to the staff. And then they are in what we call leather restraints, which really attaches them to the bed or wherever they happen to be. Usually it'll be on a stretcher or in a bed. Physical restraints like yes, sir. Joy?
I want to pose a hypothetical question about something that you mentioned before. This is something I've certainly seen often in visiting patients in hospitals. You have a hospital room with two patients in it, and one of them is groaning and moaning constantly, probably 24 hours a day, and the other patient is having difficulty in recuperating precisely because of that. Would that be an instance, if then the staff were to give the person who is groaning and moaning loudly 24 hours a day, if that person were to be given something to quiet them down, would that be a reportable
Yes.
example of elder abuse?
Yes. And the way to deal with that, unfortunately, doesn't always happen, but you need to move the person who's not moaning and groaning into a room where they don't have to be with that person. Or that person who's moaning and groaning should be moved to a room where they won't be disturbing other people.
So
And
the-
that
so-
is for sure, that is for sure abuse. It's abuse.
So it's an abuse of the person who is not groaning.
Yes, it is, because it's emotional, psychological. That person can't sleep, probably doesn't want to eat, isn't recuperating. So yes, it could be considered an elder abuse situation. Yeah. And I know that we've all been there. If we haven't been there ourselves, we walk down the hall in a hospital and you can hear the person screaming and moaning and groaning, and it's frightening. And those people need to be in a room where the door could be closed. I'm not saying they should be sedated, but they need to be put in a situation where they're not going to disturb everybody else. And there are lots of people like that. I was recently in the emergency room downtown at Sutter, not as a patient, as a family member. And I was shocked at all the rooms that had police attachés with the patient, because the patient was either on drugs or in some way maybe incarcerated, and they needed to have a person with them at all times to protect others as well as themselves. And a lot of times those things are suicide watches also. So you bring up a good point. And when you're in a multiple room or a multiple setting with other people, you can't always control what's happening, but it should be addressed. And the family member really needs to speak up. Everybody needs an advocate. And we should all be advocates for our loved ones. Everybody needs an advocate. I keep thinking that one of these days, maybe I'll form a group of volunteer advocates. So anybody wants to get involved in that, let me know. And I'm not sure how to go about it, but I do know that if we don't advocate for ourselves or our loved ones or our friends and neighbors, things don't happen, especially if they're older. And isn't that sad? But that's just the way it is these days. So more talk about the examples of physical abuse includes restraints, not just those leather restraints, but soft restraints are also a restraint. Definition of restraint medically says that if the person cannot reach a part of their body, then they are considered restrained. In other words, if they are in a wheelchair and their arms are tied to the arms of the chair, then they can't reach their leg to scratch an itch, for instance. And so that is considered abuse. In my earlier nursing days, when people were possibly going to fall out of bed or were restrained in the bed, we also had side rails. Today, you don't have side rails in most places on the hospital beds. They're considered a restraint and they're considered an abuse of the person. Yes. Dwight's looking at me with his mouth open. Yes, it's true. And I think it's wrong, actually, because if a person needs to be kept from falling out of bed, I think having a side rail is a darn good idea. And if you, go ahead.
I had a friend who was severely ill, and I visited him in his, so he was in hospice, but back in his room. I came to his room and he was in his own bed with no side rails and one leg off, and he was only semi-conscious. I instantly ordered a hospital bed with side rails. I assumed that that was standard, and it was delivered, and it kept him from falling out of bed.
You
And you're
know,
telling me that that's illegal?
It's not, I don't know if illegal is the right term, but when the state makes their inspections, if they see a person in a bed with 2 full side rails, they will write them up for abusing that patient. For confining
Shocking.
them. It is shocking and it's
Thank you,
horrible.
state.
Yes. I'd like to make sure that people understand, when I was teaching my caregivers, I was always sure to say something about the fact that when an adult comes into a nursing home, for instance, they're usually going to be, or always going to be, in a single bed. But they most likely came from a double bed or a queen or a king size bed at home. So their spatial reference is going to be off. And so they may turn over thinking they're in the bed and they could wind up on the floor. And it's lots of injuries that way. Some nursing homes will actually put a mattress on the floor for people to sleep on that mattress or to fall onto it if they're going to fall out. Because they can't use the side rails, we'll put a mattress on the floor and let the person sleep there rather than fall out of bed. It doesn't make sense, but it happens to be the way it is. And side rails, by the way, just so you know for the future, side rails don't have to be the length of the whole bed. They could be 2 on the side, one for the upper part, one for the lower part of the bed. And so you can maybe just use the upper ones. You don't have to use the full set of side rails. And if you've ever been in a hospital bed, you would know that those side rails help you to move from side to side. They help you to reposition yourself. They're really very valuable. And the fact that the state has deemed them inappropriate is unthinkable. But then again, it's the state. What can I say?
What about skin tears?
Right.
Side rails.
She's asking. what
Skin
about
tears
skin-
because
about skin
and-
tears because of the side rails. If the person is positioned properly and they don't have restraints, just they're lying in bed, they shouldn't have skin tears. Although a lot of elderly people do have very frail, delicate skin. And sometimes the injuries to the skin are not from abuse, but they may look like they're abused, but it's just because they're frail and their skin is so delicate, and also could have something to do with being dehydrated also. So, yeah.
We have a comment from Laura. It happened to my mother in the hospital. The staff ignored her groaning. We found out that they've not given her medication, and when we started it again, she stopped groaning. She was in pain and they ignored her.
Elder abuse. She was invisible to them. They didn't pay attention. And I know Devorah's mother, and if she was moaning, she was in pain. And isn't that sad? That just makes my heart ache because there's no reason for that. People shouldn't have to suffer. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you, Devorah. Yes.
You're welcome.
Oh, sorry. I just wondered if there was something that we who agree there should be side rails can do about it. If we, do we all write letters to this? Who do we write to? Who do we complain to?
Question that the California Department of Public Health oversees nursing homes. And I think the best way to do it is to have the doctor order side rails for your patient, and then it's a doctor's order and they have to do it. But people need to know to request that and have the nursing staff agree to put in that request to the doctor. And they don't need to put the request into the doctor. You can put it in, I can put it in and say, I'm really afraid my family member is going to fall out of bed. I want an order for side rails. And if they do that, they can have them. It just amazes me that they've taken them away as a form of abuse. Yes, Rick?
I suggest maybe there's a lot more to this issue. I did a little research. I am not at all that familiar with nursing home situations, although I have certainly had relatives in them and been in a few, but there are a lot of other issues out there involving side rails. I think that hospital facilities have experienced accidents that have happened when people have rolled into the side rails and gotten trapped. And
Yes.
there's been litigation involved and there's been all kinds of other problems. So I think that there are alternatives where they can use warning devices and other things that maybe aren't being used properly or sufficiently because they're more expensive. But I think the side rail issue may be a little bit more complicated than simply abandoning them and leaving nothing in return there. I think there are reasons why this has happened that are probably legitimate reasons. I just want to suggest that I understand that there are a variety of issues involving this. So it's not that maybe not quite that cut and dry.
Okay, I appreciate your comment. And I think you're right. But I think that it really depends on the patient's situation, the patient's family, and the staff itself. If you've got good nursing staff in a facility, hopefully they're going to be so observant that none of these things, the negative things, will happen. But it's true, if somebody gets caught in a side rail, they can be injured severely. It's true. And restraints also, the soft restraints that people tie around someone to keep them from falling out of a wheelchair, for instance, they serve a purpose, but they can also be very damaging. In fact, I remember one situation where the person had a waist tie around her waist for keeping her in the wheelchair. And she wiggled and wiggled and squiggled until it got all the way up here. And then she could choke, and she almost did. Just happened that somebody saw it before it happened. But these are all real situations, unfortunately. One of the other things that happens that is an abuse is force feeding someone. When I was a much younger nurse and just started my nursing in Sacramento, I worked in a nursing home where the nurse director was very old school. And when somebody wouldn't eat, she would take what we called an asepto syringe. It looks like a turkey baster. And she would fill it with formula or mush and hold the person's nose till they open their mouth to breathe, and then shove the food down their throat. And if that sounds like abuse to you, then you're right, because that's definitely abuse. Her goal was legitimate. She wanted people to get nutrition. That wasn't the best way to go about it. And that would have been abuse. I've never forgotten that. I see her doing that. And I love this woman. But this one thing that she did, I thought was, how could you do this? But her motivation was good. Her technique was not so hot. So we have any kind of physical punishment, like you have to do this or you have to do that. One of the things that happens in nursing homes especially is they have activities. And they want people to go to the activities. Sometimes they'll take them whether they want to go or not. That's kind of a form of abuse too. Striking with or without an object obviously is abuse. Pushing, shoving, shaking, hitting, beating, slapping, kicking, pinching, burning, all of those things. I guess some rap person could probably do a song with that. But the truth is that those are all things that are abusive and they happen a lot. Also, I hope none of you have to have someone in a nursing home ever, but in case you do, one of the things, or three of the things that I have here are very common problems, and they are a form of physical abuse. You lose the person's hearing aids, so now they can't communicate. You lose their glasses, or you step on them and you don't get them fixed so they can't see. And if they have dentures and you don't find them or you put them someplace and they disappear, that impacts the way they eat, the way they talk, the way they feel about themselves. And keep in mind that dentures in the mouth of an older person were made for that person possibly when they were in their 40s or 50s. If they're now in their 80s, those dentures may not fit as well, but to get new dentures made for somebody would be really difficult and really expensive. So I would like to urge all of us, make sure that if your loved one's in a nursing home, they keep track of those dentures. I can't tell you how many times dentures go missing because the person will have lunch, take the dentures out, stick them under their pillow or in the pillowcase, and they wind up in the laundry. Now go figure out which of your 100 patients they belong to when 90 patients have dentures. It is a real situation. In some places, they actually write the person's last name inside the dentures underneath where you can't see it unless they go, like that. And then you see it and wonder what that is. But it's a real problem. Possessions in a facility, disappearing, winding up on the neighbor next door, the patient next door, those are real concerns for people. And if the loss of these items impedes their ability to see, hear, chew, talk, that's abuse. More red flags. If an elder person reports being hit or slapped or kicked or mistreated, that's something we need to take care of. Most people will not make that up. And they will not tell you in front of the abuser. So that's why it's important to talk with people aside, quietly, where nobody else knows what's going on. If the person has a sudden change in behavior, like they become very withdrawn, or they look like they're fearful, or they don't want to communicate, or any of these types of things, that's a red flag that something's going on that shouldn't be. And the caregiver's refusal to allow visitors to see the patient alone or the senior alone, that's definitely a red flag. Very much so. Because they're hiding something. More signs of physical abuse, signs of being restrained. We've talked about that. Signs of being over or under medicated. If the person's supposed to have pain medication like Devorah's mom, and she's supposed to have it every 4 hours, and you're too busy having your dinner break when it's her 4 hours are up, then get somebody else to give the medication. People shouldn't suffer because they're at the whim of a caregiver. And that happens in the home as well. Bleeding, open wounds, cuts and burns, any type of untreated injuries, bed sores, sprains, dislocations, internal injuries, which you might not be able to see, but if the person's coughing up blood or passing blood in their stool, it might be because they were injured, punched, abused. And it's very sad and it shouldn't happen. Here's a brief picture. No, yeah, there she is. This lady, look at those eyes. So anytime you see welts or rope marks or skull fractures or lacerations, you can be sure that the person didn't do this to themselves. Here's another look at bruising. And another. And one more. And these should make you all cringe because they're pretty awful. So now we move into elder sexual abuse, which is also physical abuse, but it's its own category. And elder sexual abuse is defined as coercing an older person through force, trickery, threats, or other means to an unwanted sexual activity. Sexual contact with elders who are unable to grant consent is considered elder abuse, sexual elder abuse. Any non-consensual sexual activity to any kind, but not limited to unwanted touching, any types of sexual assault and battery, unwanted relations with a spouse or a partner also is considered sexual abuse. And in my days in the nursing home, again, not as a resident or a patient, I'm happy to say, but as a caregiver, as a nurse, we did see sometimes, not often, but where a husband would come to visit the wife and want to have sexual relations. And the wife was in no way physically able or mentally able or aware. And we would sometimes have to stop a spouse from coming in. And if they persisted, we'd have to report them as being abusive. Very sad. Elder abuse on people, sexual elder abuse can include the offender forcing the elder to view pornographies or listen to explicit sexual accounts or comments. I would not have thought of that myself, but this is in the literature. Forcing people to look at pornography is considered elder abuse. Coerced nudity and sexually explicit photography, also sort of pornography. Sexualized kissing and fondling, oral genital contact, digital penetration, vaginal rape, anal rape, rape by objects, attacking a victim's genitals with blows or weapons. These things happen, and they are obviously awful, and they are abuse. For an older person to be sexually abused, it can have lots of negative impact. For instance, it could exacerbate, make their current existing illness worse. It could make it longer for them, take longer for them to recover. And they also, especially if they have a family, they may not want to talk about it to the family, and so they may not have a support system. There are also generational differences in beliefs about sex and sexual abuse, as we all know. So rigid gender roles was something that was more apparent in the people who are now in their 80s and 90s than they are now. For instance, women who are now, even in my age range, we never had a nurse assistant to do personal care in the private area. It was the only time anybody was near our private areas when we're having a baby or being examined and getting ready to have a baby. But now caregivers can be male or female. And I would like to say that I think most male caregivers are not going to abuse their female patients. But I've always thought if you're a male caregiver, you better have a female there with you because you need to protect the male as well as the female patient. Because even if they're doing routine care, it may be misinterpreted. And it could be abusive if the person wants to abuse them. Anything sexual should not be discussed in years gone by. And domestic and child abuse, sexual abuse were not issues that were dealt with years ago. They are now more obvious, and they are happening, unfortunately, more widely. So again, signs of sexual abuse can include, but not be limited to, bruises around the breasts, around the genitals, unexplained vaginal or anal bleeding, stained or bloody underclothing, and reports themselves by the elderly that they've been assaulted. And if somebody says that, you need to take them seriously. Elder sexual abuse has, for the elderly, a more substantial increased chance of sustaining a serious injury, increased vaginal or anal tearing and bruising that may never heal fully. Brittle pelvis or hip bones can be broken by friction and or weight, and increased risk of infections which may not heal, including sexually transmitted diseases. Excuse me while I... Oh, okay. Here's a chart that just briefly shows you the difference of sexual abuse at home and sexual abuse in a nursing home. In a nursing home, I think it's less likely because it's a more regulated environment and there are people around to see what's going on and to hear what's going on. If you have 3 people in a room and a curtain drawn between the 3, you're going to know what's going on next to you. If you're at your home in your own living room and somebody comes in to do something bad, maybe nobody else around to know about it. There are also protective services and mandatory reporting laws that help to prevent some of this abuse in a facility. including law enforcement. There's the Ombudsman Program. Do you know about the Ombudsman Program? Possibly you do. The Ombudsman Program is county-run, and these are people who work for this program who are trained on how to deal with things in nursing homes and assisted care living places in case there's a problem for that person. They're not, sometimes it's as simple as they're not getting their coffee in the morning, or it's cold when they get it. That's a real problem to some people. But sexually abusive problems are definitely at a level that the ombudsman should get involved with. The California Department of Public Health also oversees caregivers and nurses, nursing home administrators, and so on. And as an aside, my husband's first cousin's wife just became named the administrator of the California Department of Public Health. And she was in charge of epidemiology for the state. Now she is the big shot over that whole thing. So we're very proud of Erica. In a nursing home environment, there should be staff coming in and out of rooms all the time. So there should not be an ability for anybody to be abusive. But of course, in the home, you're on your own. Nursing home abuse involves elder abuse that includes homicide, it can, or physical and sexual assault, it can, or neglect, it can, and inappropriate restraints. There is a statistic that says that people who work in nursing homes, specifically nursing assistants, have the greatest risk of being injured and abused of all healthcare providers, of all workers, actually, anywhere. People come in, they're angry. They don't want their person to be in a nursing home, so they take it out on the staff. They get spit at, hair pulled, neck chokeholds as the caregivers sometimes. And it's very important that when those things happen to the caregivers that they don't reciprocate. Because obviously if they reciprocate, that's elder abuse. In a nursing home setting or any kind of facility, it's possible that there will be financial abuse, identity theft, isolation, not because they have a contagious disease, but because it's a punishment, verbal threats, intimidation, undue influence, and there are cultural factors and gender issues that are now very prevalent in healthcare in facilities, especially for the senior LGBT people who are afraid to go to nursing homes. They're afraid they will be mistreated. They're afraid they won't be respected or cared for, and their partner may not be able to be with them. It's a very sad situation these days. These nursing home practices do result in chronic neglect, substandard care, overcrowding, authoritarian practices. You will take a shower now. You will eat now what I've made for you. Failure to protect residents against untrained workers, troubled or predatory workers, and abuse of other residents or visitors.
Assisted living.
Actually, not really. Any type of facility. I'm saying nursing home, it's the more general category, but it could be the same in assisted living. The chances are in assisted living, people are more alert usually and more aware of what's going on around them than they may be in a nursing home. But yes, assisted living has a lot of these same problems. And that's sad. Go ahead, Linda.
Having my mother been in assisted living when she had Alzheimer's, one of the things that makes a big difference is for the child or whoever it is to show up frequently.
Yes.
I mean, you're advocating for your loved one, and the staff pay more attention to you when they see you there.
Yes, and you should go different times, different days.
Exactly.
Not every day at lunchtime. So that's really important. Thank you for sharing that. That's really important. Sometimes there's overcrowding in facilities, and sometimes there is a risk of having people working as caregivers who are not trained and have maybe a questionable background. There was a lot of that going on in Texas years ago where they were hiring the caregivers from the local prison. And I don't have to tell you what that was like. I have awful videos I could show you, but I won't because they're horribly disturbing about people being abused, physically abused. You know what a wheelie is? When you kind of tilt somebody back. They used to tilt these people back and then kind of forward them into the bed like it was a game. It's horrible. Hopefully that's changed by now. That's no offense, but well, I shouldn't say what I'm going to say. I'll stop. But we need to have rules, and the rules have to be abided by. So again, another form of abuse could be denying the people in assisted living or in a nursing home what they want to do. When do they want to eat? When do they take a shower? Are they used to taking a shower at bedtime all their lives? Now you're forcing them to take a shower in the morning. That's not right. That's abuse. And I can't tell you how many people I've heard screaming, no, 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 because the caregiver doesn't wait till the water warms up and they're freezing. And that's so insensitive, and that's abuse. When do they want to get up? When do they want to go to bed? And what other activities do they want to participate in? Pressuring residents to participate in activities is abuse. Labeling people, and this is one of my pet peeves, labeling people, whether it's assisted living or a nursing home, or even someone in home care, labeling somebody as difficult, troublesome, stubborn, mean, not wanting to participate. How about using a positive term like they prefer to stay in their room, not that they refuse to go to bingo. Maybe they've never played bingo in their lives. Why should they start playing now, right? And these are kinds of things that labeling, if you say that person's stubborn and you say it to enough staff, they're all going to react to them as if they're stubborn. Not a good thing. And this is disturbing also. It's been noted that some facilities engage in discriminatory practices, such as emphasizing the activities that favor the more capable residents. So if you're not capable or you have dementia and you're not abusive, you're not doing things that are destructive or interruptive, you should be able to be in an activity with everybody else just to see other people. But if they leave you locked in your room, that's abuse. So now we move on to neglect, which is another source, another form of elder abuse. The failure or refusal to provide an elderly person with the things they need, such as food, water, clothing, shelter, medicine, comfort, personal hygiene, personal safety, and other essentials that they may feel are necessary. Signs of this neglect could be dehydration, malnutrition, poor hygiene, helping somebody else to do their mouth care, their brushing their teeth or their dentures. If you've never done it for anybody else, you might not realize that this is sometimes difficult, but it has to be done. Bed sores, contractures. This is a contracture. When your hand gets frozen like this, it's usually because nobody's bothered to exercise your hands or whatever part of the body we're talking about. Any type of immobility is neglect, could be neglect. It could be the injury or could be the illness, but it could also be from neglect. And any unsafe and hazardous living conditions in homes. Throw rugs are the #1 safety issue in a personal home. If you have them, please get rid of them or make sure they're tacked down well. I see two of our people talking to each other as if it is an issue. I had an aunt, may she rest in peace, who had throw rugs. And I kept saying, Aunt Betty, please get rid of them. No, they're to keep my carpet safe. I said, yes, but you can have safe carpet and a broken hip. Which is more important? She never did get rid of them, I'm afraid. She also had a saying, by the way, that I loved. She used to say, life is like a roll of toilet paper. The closer you get to the end, the faster it goes. Some truth, I guess, in that. Neglect is obviously the failure of one person to take care of another, and it also has to do with the fiduciary responsibilities to provide care for an elder. Examples would be not paying for home care services that are necessary, or failure on the part of an in-home service provider to provide the necessary care. These providers sometimes get paid by the person, not by the action, and so they might limit the care once they have a contract to take care of that person. That's abuse. Financial abuse and exploitation, the illegal or improper use of an elder's funds, assets, property, money, any of that. And abusers rely on the elder's inability to understand the fine print of a contract, which leads to more fraud. Investment fraud, there are lots of things like that going on. We'll talk about these things more in detail in the last session that's all about scams. Yes, ma'am.
That I'd like to point out that my husband and I are real estate brokers, and we, for the first time in 46 years, had the experience of having someone who happens to be a federal court judge being power of attorney for their relative who's incapacitated and can't make decisions and so forth. And what I wanted to say was, if you have a power of attorney and you intend to utilize that in some way, you need to have the original, not a copy
Of the documents.
of an original. And if you don't, you can't move forward.
That's good to
And
know.
I had never heard of that. And now in this case, they can't find the original.
Oh,
So, and so I don't know if it'll turn up or not, but
let me ask you a question as a realtor. Do you know if you have any responsibility to report elder abuse if you happen to be aware of it? Like somebody's trying to cheat somebody out of property, for instance?
I don't know.
Well, hopefully you haven't come across it, but it's a
I
good thing to
haven't
think about,
I
right?
haven't come across that.
It's great.
Yeah.
This example of financial abuse is where the older person turns to her next door neighbor and lets the next door neighbor help her with gardening, with changing light bulbs. And then eventually he starts going to the grocery store for her, and she gives him cash and he doesn't bring home the change, or she doesn't have cash, so she gives him her credit card to go to the store. I don't have to tell you what could happen, but it takes a long time sometimes for elderly people who are generally trusting, which is why they're such victims of elder abuse, especially financial, to finally say to somebody, you know, I think I'm a little short on funds. I don't understand where the money's going. And then you look to this person next door who's so nice and so helpful and so unethical, for lack of another word. Okay, financial self-neglect. Person does not manage their own finances, doesn't pay their bills, and so on. And this then can lead to other problems. Maybe their insurance policies will lapse. Maybe their bank accounts will get depleted and they don't know it because they're not paying bills. Oftentimes, this type of self-neglect is related to people with addictions or dementia who are not thinking clearly and taking care of their own responsibilities. It basically is the inability to manage finances, and it may be one of the early symptoms of dementia. The consequences of financial self-neglect: eviction of wherever they're living, homelessness, foreclosure on their property, termination of utilities. All of a sudden, we don't have any heat, light, and water because we're not paying our bills. And my example of my understanding of PG&E is they don't give you nothing if you don't pay for it, right? So termination of insurance, inability to afford necessary things such as food and medication. This is all considered financial self-neglect. Identity theft is a form of financial abuse, and it's a situation where I'm sure you're pretty much familiar with this. Thieves use the victims' names, their social security numbers, other identifying information, and they apply for telephone service, credit cards, loans, buy things, and lease cars. And the person who was the legitimate owner of this identity is out of luck. It's very hard to get that back if you lose your identity. Or it may not be so hard to get it back, but it's hard to right the wrongs that have been done. This is something called identity cloning, which I hadn't heard that term until I was preparing for this class. The imposters who use the victim's information to establish new lives. They may steal the person's identity, and they may be able to use it. If you remember Dorothea Puente living in Sacramento, all you remember Dorothea Puente, she was using people's social security cards to get their social security payments. That may not be a problem anymore. We may not have social security, I don't know. But it's possible that she had all these people whose social security she was collecting, and they were in her front yard, underground. Do you remember? And she looked like this sweet little old lady. Nobody would have thought of her doing those things. But there are people who do definitely steal other people's identities and use them for negative reasons. Criminal ID theft is when imposters like Dorothea provide other people's information instead of their own. And they do that until they're stopped by law enforcement, if they're ever found. I'm not really sure how they ever found Dorothea. I can't quite remember, but it was a big thing. I think there were 7 bodies buried in her front lawn. And I still can picture her. She was a sweet little old lady. You would have never thought it. When warrants for arrest are issued, they are then in the victim's names and not necessarily in the person, or they'll be in the victim's names. That's the person whose identity was stolen. And then they have to go through lots of hoops to get that corrected. Undue influence is a really serious thing, and I'm sure you can understand what it is. People use their power, their role, the fact that people trust them and are dependent on them and are afraid of them, and they influence the person, mostly the elderly, to do things that they shouldn't need to do, don't want to do. And it is a critical part of senior abuse, including the financial, physical, or sexual. Undue influence is a form where the victim doesn't feel like they have a choice, and so they wind up just doing what they're told they have to do. Vulnerability could be due to poor or declining health for the older person, being dependent on the other person for their care, problems with vision, hearing, speaking, problems with memory, problems communicating and understanding. If the person tends to be a passive person, they're more likely to be abused with undue influence. Emotional distress can make people more prone to being abused by undue influence. Language and literacy barriers are a problem. If you have someone who you're working with and they don't understand you and you don't understand them, that's a problem. Isolation from others is a problem, and living in a chaotic or dysfunctional environment is a problem. I don't know anybody who lives in a dysfunctional environment. Certainly not me. Isolation, the purposeful prevention of communication between an elder and others. This is again a form of elder abuse. Without the elder's consent or knowledge, when the action is not in the elder's best interest. The next one is abandonment, and it's the forsaking or desertion of an elder person when you are supposed to be responsible for their care. And I know that when I was in a nursing home setting, nurses were afraid to leave because they didn't want to be accused of abandoning a patient. For instance, the staff didn't show up for the evening shift, so they require the day shift to stay and do a double shift, for instance. And if they don't stay, they can be accused of abandoning their patients. Now, that's not really the way it should be, but I know that there are places where they threaten the caregivers with a charge of abandonment if they don't stick around, and that's really unfair. The other listing there is dumping, and I don't know if you know what that stands for, but having worked in hospitals and nursing homes over the years, I've seen a pattern where relatives come and they dump their relatives at the emergency room at Christmas time or any other holiday time, or they want to take a vacation and they don't want to be bothered by the elder who may live with them. So they take them to the hospital and they dump them there. And then the hospital has to make plans to do whatever they need to do, maybe find some other caregiver. But I've seen it happen, and it's so sad because the elderly person knows that they're being dumped. This dumping could happen also, and abandonment could happen also at a nursing home, an assisted living facility, a public location, or just at home. They could just be abandoned. Abduction is another form of abuse where someone is taken. This really pertains to California, as far as I know, where someone is taken out of California for whatever reason, usually, probably financial, and then they are not allowed to return to California. And so when something like this happens, it is a form abduction. Don't hear of it too often, but it does happen. So nursing home abuse, we've talked about some of this already. I'm going to skip over some of this. Verbal threats in a nursing home are a problem. I like this little cartoon. It says, sorry, Jeremy, I skipped ahead of you. Hey, no bedpan? My bedpan needs cleaning. Where is everybody? And the other caption says, Home Alone 23, the final chapter. That is another form of abuse, by the way. Someone has their light on, they need to go to the bathroom, and they are not attended to, and then they become incontinent, and then they become embarrassed, and then they become really unhappy. This should not happen. And then there's self-neglect. And if you see the graphic, it says, I need a house with more counter space. I think that's probably true for everybody. But elders neglect themselves in many ways. The refusal or failure of an adult to exercise self-care or to perform essential care tasks is considered self-neglect. It is similar to neglect, but there's no perpetrator. The person neglects themselves. Self-neglect means they adequately don't take care of themselves for health and safety. They don't meet the demands of daily living. They don't obtain adequate food and water. They don't bathe and groom themselves. They may or may not take their medications, and they may or may not pay their bills. It applies to people, self-neglect, regardless of their education, their income, their ethnicity, their geographic location, their social lifestyle. Anybody can be self-neglecting. It is common amongst people who are elderly and have disabilities, and especially dementia. Self-neglect, isolation. I think a lot of us went through some of this during COVID. We were isolated. Some of us are still sort of isolated because there's always that possibility of COVID lurking. It may lead to a loss in personal integrity, estrangement from family and friends, inability to care for oneself, and deterioration of the ability to think and make decisions. If a person is neglecting themselves so badly that they aren't able to take care of their ways of doing business every day, personal, financial, and so forth, they may need to be conserved. And that is a difficult situation to have to deal with. Most people who are at risk of isolation and self-neglect are frail, chronically ill, widowed or divorced and live alone, more likely to be female, may have reduced resources, and may be members of a marginalized community. Self-neglect also does include things like dehydration, malnutrition, unattended to needs, medical needs, poor hygiene, all of these things that you can see on the screen. They are all possible results of self-neglect. If you were to go into someone's house and it smells like a bathroom, you know that they're neglecting themselves and their physical as well as their personal environment. Hoarding is meant to be considered part of self-neglect. I prefer the term saving for me, but self-neglect, people, have you seen any of the hoarding shows on television? It's incredible how much stuff people keep. Inadequate clothing or the lack of taking care of their medical needs is also self-neglect. Self-neglect accounts, this is interesting, I think. Self-neglect accounts for the majority of cases reported to Adult Protective Services. Isn't that interesting? It's not other people doing the abuse, it's self-neglect. And if possible, and the person is willing, there are services to help them in the community so that they can still continue to live on their own, but they can have support. And I have some pictures to show you of what self-neglect looks like. I don't imagine you've ever seen. Linda, you may have seen this in some of those houses you visit, I think. Can you imagine? Did you say it looks good to you? Did you? No, I hope not. So here's more. Not taking out the trash. I have been in homes where the toilets look not quite like this, but not usable. They're very sad. And then, of course, we have psychological and emotional abuse, the infliction of fear, anguish, agitation, or other emotional distress through verbal and or nonverbal acts. Emotional elder abuse is a verbal or nonverbal act that inflicts emotional pain. It includes threatening, humiliating insults, saying hurtful words, whatever they might be, yelling, especially obscenities, repeatedly ignoring the older adult, especially with people with dementia. When they repeat, they tend to get ignored. And what we have to think about and tell other people to think about is the person who's doing the repetitive conversation doesn't realize they're doing it. And you have to think of it as every time it's the first time for them. Here's a picture of a little lady who's really suffering. Signs of social, psychological, and emotional abuse really does involve all of these things on the screen. And if the person reports to you or to someone else, you know that they are reporting that they are being verbally assaulted, insulted, threatened, intimidated, humiliated, and harassed. That's abuse and it needs to be reported. Once again, people don't like to mention these things if it's a family member or if the abuser is dependent on them or they are dependent on the abuser. Signs of psychological emotional abuse, people just get quiet. They don't want to talk. They don't want to interact. They may have low self-esteem. They may be uncooperative and aggressive because they're angry about the abuse that is coming their way. They may have a change in their appetite because they're not happy with the way mealtime is handled. They may be confused, lonely, and have feelings of helplessness. Psychological and emotional abuse is almost always accompanied with other forms of abuse. So, do you have any comments or questions that you would like to put forward? Anybody on Zoom want to have a chat, comment? Okay. I hope you found this presentation helpful. I hope you never have to experience any of these things. I would like you to know the next presentation will be Sunday, March 30th at 10 here in the library or on Zoom. And it's going to be a profile of an elder abuse victim, the risk factors for elder abuse, and recognizing elder abuse. Please RSVP to Talia, and her information is here, and it's also on your email, I'm sure. And then last but not least, please drive home safely. And luckily, it's not raining.
Thank you, Trudy, for a very informative and interesting presentation. We look forward to the next 1, 2, 3, right?
Right.
Okay, and thank you.
Yes.
But
Thank you, everyone.
round of applause from the computer.
Thank you for the Zoom attendees also.
And also Trudy, yeah, this is such an important topic. And I think a lot of people don't want to hear it and don't want to listen to it.
Yeah.
So we need to,
The word out.
get the word out because it really is an important topic. Yeah.
Thank you.
And it will be recorded. It's recorded.
Right.
So you can share with people, hey, there is this wonderful recording. I mean, we need
Thank
to
you.
get the word
Yeah.
out.
It's true that if you know somebody who wanted to attend and couldn't attend or wasn't able to get on the Zoom, they can go back to send an email to Talia. She will send you the link and you will be able to see the recording of the program.
Yeah, because it's again, it's just
you.
invaluable information. We
Thank
thank
you.
you very much
My
for your
pleasure.
efforts.
Thank you very much for attending and Zooming and in person. Have a wonderful rest of your day.